So after knowing when to start capitalizing, after knowing when to stop capitalizing class, what does this tell us? Borrowing cost incurred before commencement and borrowing cost incurred after cessation class should not be capitalized but should just be reported as an interest expense. So the period of time in which you can capitalize borrowing cost is between commencement and cessation or completion. But even between the commencement date class and the cessation or completion date class, there may be times in which you will have to stop capitalizing borrowing cost. Let me repeat that one. Borrowing costs before commencement date report as interest expense. Borrowing costs after cessation or completion date will also be reported as an expense. When can you capitalize? When can you include borrowing costs as part of the cost of an asset? Only if it pertains to borrowing costs incurred between the commencement date and the completion date. But as a final note class, even within this period class, the time between the commencement and the completion date, there may be times in which you will have to suspend capitalization of your borrowing cost. And basically, class, the main reason is that there are no progress or developments undertaken in relation to the completion of the qualifying asset. If there is a significant amount of time, class, in which no development has happened to the qualifying asset, then you will have to suspend capitalizing borrowing cost. What does it mean if we suspend capitalization of borrowing cost? The interest incurred during that time will not be included in the cost of the asset but will instead be reported as an expense. So again, to emphasize, it's possible that even between the commencement and the completion date, borrowing costs may not be capitalized. And when will that happen? During times in which no progress has happened. Specifically, class, the standard tells us that an entity shall suspend capitalization of borrowing costs during extended periods in which it suspends active development of a qualifying asset. This should make sense, class. The only reason that we are capitalizing borrowing cost, class, is because we believe that the use of the money is in relation to the construction or development of the qualifying asset. If the funds remain idle, class, if we will have to pay interest, but we did not pursue any progress or development to the qualifying asset, then the interest that we will have to pay should not be included as part of the cost of the asset. It should be reported as an expense. So again, to answer the question, when do you suspend capitalization of borrowing costs? You do that when there are extended periods in which active development of a qualifying asset are also suspended. But please understand, class, that not all interruptions or delay in the construction class will result in suspension of capitalization. And this is where you should focus, class, because this is where students are tested. Whether a particular interruption or delay is enough to suspend capitalization of your borrowing cost. And the standards provide you with sufficient examples, class, as to what interruptions will be considered sufficient to suspend capitalization and what interruptions or delays are considered part of the development process, and thus no suspension of capitalization will be required. So the standard warns us, class, that even though no physical construction is being undertaken, class, but substantial technical and administrative work are being performed, then it should not be a reason for you to suspend capitalizing your borrowing cost. The technical and administrative work will still be considered a progress or development in the construction or preparation of your qualifying asset. And again, as I mentioned earlier, not all delays, class, will result in suspension. If there's only a temporary delay, class, and the delay is a necessary part of the process of getting the asset ready for its intended use or sale, then you will still continue capitalizing borrowing costs during the temporary delay. Again, no suspension if the temporary delay is an essential part of the construction or production process. So basically, that would be all, class. Past 23 involves borrowing cost, the cost that result from the interest that we'll have to pay for our borrowings or our liabilities to finance our qualifying asset. Past 23 tells us that interest can be capitalized if it is directly attributable to the construction or production of a qualifying asset. But very important, it should only pertain to a qualifying asset. All other instances, interest has to be expensed. What are qualifying assets? Qualifying assets are assets that necessarily take a substantial amount of time before they become ready for their intended use or sale. Are there items specifically excluded by the standard from its application? The answer is yes. Number one is with regard to qualifying assets that are to be measured at fair value, such as your biological assets. Even though it's a qualifying asset, but if the asset is to be measured at fair value, PAS 23 will not be applied. The other exclusion would be with regard to inventories, that are produced or manufactured in large quantities and on a repetitive basis. But if you'll be asked, can an inventory be a qualifying asset? The answer is yes. Can an inventory result in capitalization of borrowing costs? The answer is yes. But why do we say that inventories are part of the exclusion? Inventories are part of the exclusion only if it pertains to inventories that are produced in large quantities and on a repetitive basis. Next question that should be part of our stock knowledge is, what amount should be capitalized as our borrowing cost? The answer would depend on the source of the funds, whether it's a specific borrowing or a general borrowing. If it's a specific borrowing, the amount of interest that should be capitalized should be the actual amount of interest related to the specific borrowing. If the funds were taken from a general borrowing, then the amount of interest that will be capitalized would depend on the capitalization rate and the average expenditure. And again, knowing that you need the capitalization rate and the average expenditures would be enough. The actual computation for your capitalization rate and your average expenditures would be discussed in a later accounting subject. What is the treatment for interest income earned by your funds pending their use in the construction? If the interest income results from a specific borrowing, then the interest income will be a reduction to the capitalizable borrowing cost. If the interest income pertains to a general borrowing, the interest income will be reported as a separate income and will not be treated as a reduction to your capitalizable borrowing cost. Next question, when are you allowed to begin capitalizing borrowing costs? You are allowed to start capitalizing borrowing costs on the commencement date. When is the commencement date? The commencement date is the date in which the entity has already incurred borrowing costs, has already incurred expenditures in relation to the qualifying asset, and third, when it already undertakes activities necessary to prepare the asset for its intended use or sale. When do you stop capitalizing borrowing cost? We stop capitalizing borrowing cost when substantially all activities needed to finish or complete the qualifying asset are already performed. So will the capitalization of borrowing cost stop already even though there are still technical or administrative work that are to be performed? The answer is yes. If again the asset is essentially or substantially completed. What if you are still to perform minor modifications to conform to the specification of the purchaser or the customer? Will you already stop capitalizing borrowing costs? The answer is yes. If all that is left is minor modifications, then the asset will be considered as substantially completed and thus the need to stop capitalizing borrowing cost. What happens to the borrowing cost before the commencement date? It will be expensed. What happens to the borrowing cost after the completion date? It will be expensed. When will there be capitalization of borrowing cost? Only between the commencement date and the completion date. Is it possible that borrowing cost between the commencement date and the completion date will not be capitalized? Yes, if it pertains to borrowing cost in a period in which no development is being undertaken with regard to the qualifying asset. Will all interruptions or delay in the construction or development of the qualifying asset result in suspension of borrowing cost? The answer is no. Temporary delays in the construction, temporary delays that are a necessary part of the construction process will not be enough to suspend capitalization of borrowing cost. And even though no physical work is being performed, if technical and administrative work are if substantial technical and administrative work are being performed, then we will still consider that as having development or progress in the construction, and thus capitalization of borrowing costs shall continue. Capitalization of borrowing costs should only be suspended during extended periods in which the entity suspends active development of a qualifying asset. So hopefully all those items class are already included in your stock knowledge.